Alright, in this video we're going to review some of the rules that we've learned concerning the performance and breach of contracts. In going over this material, we talked about 5 different subjects. Express conditions, the constructive condition of prior performance by the other party, restitution despite a material breach, the divisibility of performances, and impracticability and frustration of purpose. Let's start by talking about express conditions. In going over this material in class, we learned 2 rules. First, the non-occurrence of an express condition excuses a performance subject to the condition, regardless whether it has a material effect on the performance. The second rule is that a party may condition performance on a subjective event, like satisfaction with the other party's performance, but when practicable, courts will interpret a condition of satisfaction to mean satisfaction of a reasonable person. Now, how do these rules play out in the actual litigation of cases? Well, usually the pattern of argumentation is fairly straightforward. The plaintiff claims that the defendant made a promise and didn't keep it. The defendant's defense is that, well, my performance of the promise was excused by the non-occurrence of an express condition. So, for example, in Luttinger's v. Rosen, the seller claimed that the buyer broke a promise to purchase the property. The buyer's defense was that their performance, the purchase of the property, was excused by the non-occurrence of an express condition. They were unable to obtain a particular type of financing upon which the sale was conditioned. And the court thought it was irrelevant whether the difference in financing could be made up some other way. So long as the condition wasn't satisfied, their performance was excused. Similarly, in Gibson v. Cranage, the plaintiff claimed that the defendant failed to pay for a portrait, and the defendant said, well, my duty to pay was conditioned upon my satisfaction with the portrait, and I wasn't satisfied. And accordingly, the court said that the defendant didn't have to pay. The next topic that we talked about is the constructive condition of prior performance. Here we saw 3 rules. First, prior performance by one party may be a constructive condition to the other party's performance. Second, substantial performance, or in other words, performance without a material breach, will satisfy this constructive condition. And third, courts determine whether material breach has occurred by considering a variety of circumstances. These circumstances are listed in Restatement Section 241. In general, though, courts are hesitant to find a material breach. What's the pattern of argumentation here? Well, again, the plaintiff's claim is that the defendant made a promise and didn't keep it. The defendant's defense, though, is that my performance was excused because the plaintiff's prior performance was a constructive condition to my performance, and the plaintiff did not perform as promised. We saw various examples of that. For example, in the Kingston v. Preston case, the buyer of a business said that the seller promised to convey the business and didn't do it, and the seller said, well, my performance conveying the business was conditioned upon the buyer's providing security, and the buyer did not provide security as promised. Now, there are 2 different replies that a plaintiff can make in response to this defense. The first is that there was no constructive condition of prior performance. Our performances were meant to be independent of each other. The court rejected that argument in Kingston v. Preston, but it did accept it in Hanks v. GAB. The court concluded that GAB still had to pay for Hanks' business, even if he violated a promise not to compete, because that promise was independent of the duty to pay for the business. It was, however, allowed to subtract an allowance for damages. The plaintiff's second reply might be, well, even though I didn't perform exactly as promised, meaning, in other words, even though I did breach, I substantially performed and therefore satisfied the constructive condition. That argument was accepted in the Jacob and Youngs v. Kent case, the Walker and Company v. Harrison case, and Plant v. Jacobs case. True, Jacob and Youngs used the wrong kind of pipe, but they still substantially performed. There was no material breach, and therefore Kent wasn't excused from paying them. He could subtract an allowance for damages if he could show any, but in that case there weren't any damages. And as we saw in the Plant v. Jacobs case, even fairly large deviations from what the contract required will sometimes be considered to be substantial performance. The reason is that otherwise the plaintiff might suffer a forfeiture, not being able to be paid, even though the plaintiff, for example, built a house for the Jacobs. The next topic we talked about was restitution despite a material breach. First rule we saw was that in some jurisdictions, a party to a contract may recover in restitution from the other party despite having committed a material breach. Second rule is that the measure of recovery is the benefit conferred in excess of any loss caused. Here the pattern of argumentation is simply the plaintiff saying, well, I conferred a benefit on the defendant in attempting to perform, and although I breached, the defendant would be unjustly enriched if he didn't pay for the benefit. So, for example, in Britton v. Turner, Britton promised to work for 12 months for Turner, but worked for only 9.5. If Britton had sued Turner, Turner might have said, well, my duty to pay you was conditioned upon your prior performance, and you didn't perform. And moreover, working for only 9.5 months instead of 12 is not substantial performance, it's a material breach. Therefore, you can't recover under the contract. But Britton was able to say, well, I still conferred a benefit on you by working for 9.5 months, and I therefore should be compensated for whatever benefit I gave you over and above whatever damages you suffered. The fourth topic we talked about was the divisibility of performances. We saw that whenever it's practicable, a court may divide a single contract into two or more separate contracts. And the second rule is that even if a plaintiff materially breached the undivided contract, the defendant's performances are not excused in any of the separate contracts which the plaintiff has substantially performed. Now, what does this mean? Well, let's talk about the pattern of argumentation. In a typical case, the plaintiff would claim again, well, the defendant made a promise and didn't keep it. The defendant's defense would then be, well, my promise was excused because the plaintiff's prior performance was a constructive condition to my performance, and the plaintiff committed a material breach. A hypothetical that we used in class was the plaintiff said, well, the defendant promised to pay me $300,000 for building 3 houses. The defendant's defense would be, well, my promise was excused because the plaintiff breached. The plaintiff only built 1 of the 3 houses. The defendant's reply would be, well, even though I committed a material breach, I didn't build the 3 houses, I only built 1. I substantially performed 1 or more divisible parts of the contract. In other words, the contract could be divided into 3 contracts to build 1 house for $100,000. And I performed 1 of those by building 1 house, and therefore I should be paid for that 1 house, even though you're excused from paying me for the other 2. We saw an attempt to use this argument in Kirkland v. Archibald. A builder was to be paid in installment payments according to the work. The trial court thought, well, we can divide this contract into separate contracts for each installment. And since the builder did enough work to get paid for the first installment, the builder should be paid for the first installment, but not for the rest of the installments. The Court of Appeals rejected that, though, and said it's not really practicable to divide one construction project of the particular kind at issue into several different parts. The last topic that we talked about is impracticability and frustration of purpose. These are 2 additional constructive conditions that might be found in contracts. Here we saw 2 rules. First, a party's performance may be excused by the occurrence of an event that renders performance impracticable if both parties assume that the event would not occur. The second rule is that a party's performance may be excused by the occurrence of an event that frustrates the party's principal purpose if both parties assume that event would not occur. What's the pattern of argumentation here? Well, the plaintiff's claim, as always, is that the defendant made a promise and didn't keep it. And here we have 2 different defenses. One defense might be, well, my performance was excused by an event which occurred that rendered my performance impracticable. And we both assume that the event would not occur. So, for example, in Taylor v. Caldwell, Taylor sued Caldwell saying, look, you promised to provide a music hall and you didn't do it. And the defense was, well, my performance was excused by an event that occurred, namely a fire, which rendered my performance impracticable. And we both assumed that no fire would occur. The court accepted that argument and concluded that Caldwell did not have to perform. Another possible defense might be, well, my performance was excused because of an event that frustrated my principal purpose. And we both assumed that the event would not occur. In Krell v. Henry, for example, Krell sued Henry saying, look, you promised to pay me the rent for my apartment and you didn't do it. And the defense was, well, I only rented your apartment for those days to watch the coronation. An event occurred, namely the coronation procession was canceled, and that frustrated my principal purpose. And we both assumed that that event would not occur. And again, the court found the promise to be excused. Now, an important point to understand is that when you have a performance which is for which the purpose is frustrated, it may be practicable to perform. It's just that the party doesn't want to. So in Crowe v. Henry, Henry could very easily have paid the money. It wasn't impracticable. It just was that he didn't want to because his purpose